Let's get some Benny on. It's thinking about it. There we go. And open up my chat window. Checking, I got my notes up. Oh dear. Hot dog, I remember my password for the chat window. Hey, Carrie. Good morning, everybody. I might have missed. Hey, Dad and Jerry and Mom and Betsy and Tom and Denise. Hey, Rodney. Hey, Heather, Emily, Karen. Hey, Jean and Dina. Hey, Emily. I see so many people with last names today who are connected. I can connect to the Johann Hawk case. It's kind of occupying my brain. I tell you, it's killing me that they can't find a clemency file for Hawk down in Springfield. I've got them looking, but they can't seem to find one. There should be one, and it should be really interesting. A couple of really critical points of the research that may or may not exist. But that happens. Hey, Cindy in snowy Detroit. Hey, Betsy and Katie and Kathy. Where am I? I'm in my apartment. Hey, Karen. But we got all the footage for a couple of tours worth of Manhattan Cemetery tours. And I was kind of going back and forth earlier in the year about what book I should do next. One about Manhattan cemeteries, similar to the Graceland Cemetery book, or Johann Hawk. I decided Johann Hawk is probably more financially sound for me right now, but then maybe I can do Manhattan Cemeteries. There's so many of these stories here that just aren't getting told. Hey, Chris and Ann. I realize I've actually got like volumes 1 and 2 of this, so one of the ones that I was really looking forward to telling today is actually in volume 2. So, oops. Morning, Vicky and Martin. Hey, Melanie. Anybody I might have missed? Hey, Chris, you're late. Tell Julius hi. But well, the iron is hawk. Hey, Ronnie. Welcome along. Hell's Princess, highly recommended. Harold Schechter's book. I just talked to Harold fairly recently about something I noticed. There was this detective group who said that they were investigating Belle at the time of her death that didn't seem to have been reported at the time. Hey, Rodney, hey, Kathleen, hey, Laurie. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, the Hawk case has just been such a fun puzzle to put together. I'll tell you what I've been doing lately, still, is just going through all 800 or so files and tagging them. Because it doesn't really work for text search when everybody's name gets spelled differently in every article. So, hey, Meg. Hey, good morning, Lori. Hey, Sherry. This is Benny Goodman coming to you live from the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago in 1936. Alexa, stop. Where is that even coming from? Hold on. Mysterious, very mysterious. Well, that's what we're all about here. Hey, Mona. Hey, Lisa. Maybe I should break out my New York sightseeing guide license just to show in front of the people here. I should. Hold on one second. Hey, Carolyn. Hey, Sherry and Meg. Hey, Lisa and Mona. There, see? New York Sightseeing Guide. Boker Tov, Lisa. Hey, Ellen. Hey, Lori and Gary and Timothy Luann. Hey, Aviva. Good morning all around. Hey, Kathleen. I got this roll of tape to work as a fidget spinner for me right now. Don't have an actual fidget spinner around here. Among the various fidgets that I got sitting around. Fidgets in my weed stash. Hey, Kirk. Hey, Heather. Oh, and hey, look who's here. Ah, hey, Miles. Hey, Vicky. Good morning, everybody. There's the real man of the hour here. Oh, yeah. Hot drinks. I forgot to bring in my tea. Hang on one second. I still got a couple minutes before we're supposed to start, so. Keep that charging for later.
Music by Benny Goodman and his orchestra, and the next tune, Sandman.
Good morning, Mary Rose. Hey, Kristen. Hey, Grace. Yeah, I got the World Cup to compete with, too. Hey, Grandma Belle. Hey, Donna. Yesterday, I was just going to stay home all day, but then the snow was just so pretty that I had to go out and look for coyotes at the cemetery. I saw one running into the prairie area, holding something in his mouth that I can't identify. It's either a toy or some hot dog buns. I can't really tell. Hey, Susie. Yeah, we say drink, but it could be water, whatever. This is some Lapsang Souchong tea, which is almost like a cocktail. It's the whiskey of tea. Hey, Katie. Hey, Nancy. Oh, I love that smiling one, too. I got so many great, facial expression coyotes that day. The other day, I found one while he was chewing on stuff. I'll put a couple of them up in here. Well, here's the one I got yesterday. I just managed to get a little bit of him. So he was running away, but carrying something in his mouth that looks like a toy. No, the other day I got one while he was chewing on some branches or roots or something. So here he is going, cheese. And that same day we got him going, I am the very model of a modern major general. I'll let Benny do one more quick one. And this one just chatting. So I says to Mabel, I says. Morning, David. Hey, Arlie. I got no pony in the fight over in the World Cup myself. Hey, Keely. Jerry, the colors are tracking collars from the Urban Coyote Research Project. They've got hundreds of them tracked here in Chicago. It should be on YouTube, Ginny. If it's not, I don't really know why. Let me see. Over on... Yeah, it says I'm streaming with 8 people watching on YouTube. Should be youtube.com/Adam Seltzer. I don't think I could get the Adam Chicago on that one. There's a couple of platforms where Adam Chicago is controlled by some guy who got it in 2008 and then never used it, and also does not respond to messages, because I'd pay. Good morning, Todd, on Twitch. Give everybody just another moment. This is a different episode of Benny Goodman at the Congress than I normally play. I got a half a dozen or so. I just usually play the one that's on archive. But I found my others on a hard drive. Yeah, Arlie, we've had some mountain lion stuff here too. There was one killed on I-55. There was one caught down by Springfield. And I swear I saw one at the zoo. Like wandering around at the zoo during the tours that I was running for them on nights in October. We were crossing over a bridge. And then I swear I saw a mountain lion or a leopard or something walk into the bushes. Everybody was telling me it was a coyote. So I go, maybe it was an elf or a leprechaun. It was nothing like that, penis breath. I know what I saw. It wasn't swamp gas. Lynn, according to the research project, a couple of the coyotes occasionally leave, but a couple of them don't. They can kind of tell by like the shape of their claws, or the wear and tear on their claws. Yeah, jackalope, fast as fast can be, you'll never catch me.
And again,
all right.
presents his lady of song, Helen Ward, singing Alone.
All right, that was Helen Ward singing with Benny Goodman and his orchestra live at the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. We've gotten through the Benny. I believe that's time that we start. Welcome along, everybody. Welcome to Mysterious Chicago. I'm Adam Seltzer of Mysterious Chicago Tours, but I am also a licensed tour guide in New York City and have been for several years now. Usually I'm in New York a month, 2 months, 3 months out of the year, usually just taking school groups around, but I also do a tour there called Grave Robbing 101 that is all around the financial district, which still has a couple of cemeteries and used to have a whole lot more of them. Here in Chicago, I've written about a dozen Chicago history books out of 20 or so books overall, including Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Murder Maps USA, a brand new one from Thames and Hudson, and Graceland Cemetery, Chicago's Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. That is my latest from University of Illinois Press, and I'd kind of like to follow that up eventually with one about the cemeteries in Manhattan. You know, when we talk about the cemeteries in Manhattan, we tend to talk about the politicians and the dignitaries who were buried there. Alexander Hamilton, of course, comes up quite a lot. But beyond that, we kind of forget that there's other interesting people buried in there as well. And this is actually volume 1 that I've got set up for cemeteries in Manhattan. There are just so many stories here. One of them I was really eager to tell today. I realize it's actually in my deck for volume 2, so we'll have to maybe do that one next weekend. And then Thursday night, we still haven't figured out exactly what we're doing yet. We'll do something cool. So, all right, we're going to start down here on the Lower East Side, where if you kind of blink, you miss it, but over in this little section is the New York Marble Cemetery, the first non-sectarian cemetery that was built in New York. Most of the earlier ones were controlled by the churches. And in 1831, New York didn't go much higher up, much further north than the Lower East Side, really. But this is, you kind of blink and you miss it, but it's this little park made of Tuckahoe marble with 258 vaults. There are sometimes gravestones up above the vaults, but mostly these are underground vaults down below. There's another shot from around it. It's just like about the size of a good-sized suburban backyard. But usually when we find burials in Manhattan, they're not usually just a coffin in the ground like you would normally think of with a cemetery. Usually they're inside of brick vaults. They look like they're just underground, but when you dig down, you find these like arched brick marble ones. This is one they found underneath Washington Square. See, here's the thing. They didn't used to have any public parks in Manhattan. Public parks in large cities are really a remarkably new phenomenon. And just about all of the major parks in Manhattan were at one time or another a cemetery. There are probably still bodies buried in Bryant Park. And when they were doing some construction not too long ago down in Washington Square Park, they found this old vault that was full of old rotted coffins. Now, it's an interesting thing. You never can tell if a coffin's going to decompose along with the rest of the body. But this is also what you get when you dig down in... If you dig down below here, you see all these little squares on the ground. If you dig in front of those, you come to... Down below will be this door that leads into a brick vault. And we'll see some more examples of these brick vaults over the course of it. So... On the inside of this one, this is a drawing from 1858 when they removed their most famous resident here. And inside they looked about like this, just some shelves with some coffins. But as of 1858, the most famous resident at New York Marble Cemetery was a guy by the name of James Monroe, former president of the United States, studied law under Thomas Jefferson, author of the Monroe Doctrine. That's probably what he's best remembered for now, is just the doctrine, and several streets named after him, including one here in Chicago. Now, after he got out of the presidency, they didn't have a pension for presidents at the time, and he was fairly well broke. He had put in a whole lot of money to putting on entertainments at the White House that he wasn't really supposed to be spending the money on. Congress wanted the money back and withheld his salary, so he was not in the best of financial situations. Eventually, they gave him like $30,000, which at the time was plenty. But he ended up moving in with his daughter and dying in New York in 1831. It was right around the same time the New York Marble Cemetery the New York City Marble Cemetery had been built. I really should specify, there's the New York Marble Cemetery and there's the New York City Marble Cemetery. They're both nearby each other. We're going to see both of them. This one is the New York City Marble Cemetery. So he was just about broke, and at the time of his death, they didn't really know what else to do with him, so they put him in the Governor family vault, which looked about like this. Now, in 1858, though, they decided to exhume the body. The governor of Virginia at the time wanted all the Virginia presidents back home. You know, this was the build-up to the Civil War. There was all this Virginia nationalism going on. And up in the north, they tried to pretend that wasn't what was going on. It was just, a shared patriotism kind of thing. So he was exhumed under cover of night. They did this very carefully. They tried to do it very respectfully and put his old iron coffin inside of a mahogany coffin. I don't think they took the body out. There's differing accounts of things like that. And then he was then put on a ship and sailed down to Virginia, where he is now at Hollywood Cemetery. General Winfield Scott, old Fuss and Feathers himself, was a pallbearer. And here's the thing. The ship nearly got sunk. There was a whole lot of rocking and wind, and one of the guys who was accompanying the coffin actually fell overboard and drowned. And that person who fell overboard and drowned was a son of Alexander Hamilton. And Monroe and Hamilton had been involved in nearly fought a couple of duels themselves over the years. We'll get into that later, because obviously we're doing Manhattan cemeteries. We got to cover Hamilton pretty soon. One other famous person who is still at the New York City Marble Cemetery, famous primarily today, I think, just for his name, was a guy by the name of Preserved Fish. That was his name, Preserved Fish, 1766 to 1846, named by his Quaker father. Quakers had a habit in those days of giving people odd names, like Fight the Good Fight of Faith Johnson, The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want Jones, or in this case, Preserved Fish. So, legend has it he was named by a sailor who just found him in the water like a preserved fish, but that doesn't really seem to have any weight to it. Didn't last long at any school or at any job until he took to the water, became a cabin boy, and worked his way up to be the captain of a whaling ship when he was 21. But then he figured out that you could make a lot more money selling whale oil than getting whale oil, so he became a merchant. At one point tried to testify in court that whale oil should not be subject to the fish oil tax, because whales weren't fish, they were mammals. He's got a point. It seems like a loophole. He beat the system. Good for him, but the case failed. I believe this was for Carolus Linnaeus and his system of binomial classification. Later, he became very close friends with a guy in Flushing, New York, but then they had a fight and he would not talk to him. And in fact, when he was nearly drowned, the guy showed up to save him and he cussed him out rather than being saved by him. He did eventually get saved, though. Became harbor master of the whole port of New York. He got married for a third time when he was an old man. He was like 73. I'm not sure how old his new wife was, but I'm guessing she wasn't anywhere close to 73. And it was right after his last wife had died, so people were kind of freaking out. And he said, "I don't care a farthing for the opinions of the world. I live for the living, not for the dead." And about 60 years later, that's very similar to what Johann Hock would say when he proposed to his last wife, while his previous wife was still lying dead in the bed. That woman's sister. Sorry, I just got Johann Hock on the brain. It's my new book project, and things will probably continue as such for a little while here, but it's going to get more and more interesting. So that's the New York City Marble Cemetery. And just around the corner from it, kind of hidden, you kind of have to know it's here, but there's this little arch, and I just happened to be there on a day when it was open at the New York City Marble Cemetery. You kind of walk down this, one of the few alleys in Manhattan, really. There aren't very many. That's something that surprises a lot of tourists. Comic books have raised us all to think that alleys are just loaded with burglars and muggers, and they don't actually even have alleys in Manhattan. But inside you got a little park-like place that looks like this. But then if you were to dig down below, this is what you would find, is these vaults down below the place full of the burials. You can see here along the wall, they've got all of the markers. Here, we'll move along the left wall a little bit. Kristen, I don't think I remember that episode of Muppet Babies. We'll move along here. So right about in this section on the left-hand side wall, the south wall, is the marker for Aaron Clark. Now, Aaron Clark was a lottery operator who became the Whig Party mayor of New York in the 1830s. It was 1837. The Panic of 1837 happened. One of the periodic depressions and panics we had a lot more often back before there was an FDIC. Banks would fail and take everybody's savings along with them. So his idea as mayor was that we would add a lot more ports. Adding more ports to New York would increase trade, but it also, of course, drove up real estate prices. At the time he got elected, because he was a Whig, the other party, the Democrats, was divided into two factions. There was the main one, which favored direct relief for sending people money, and the other side, which didn't want any improvements, didn't want any money. The Locofocos, they called them. They were always getting split into factions in those days. This was the 1830s. In the 1840s, there would be the Free Soil Democrats splitting off from everybody else. They're totally unrecognizable from modern parties, in a way. Anyway, that split the vote, so Aaron Clark got elected. But he was generally seen as favoring rich people, which was not a really good way to get popular in those days. Also, really not fond of immigrants, which also was not very good. Was not very popular at the time. But he was also known as the dancing mayor because he threw so many balls at the governor's mansion. Or at least they say that he was. I couldn't find a lot of contemporary references calling them that. Just a lot of things from years later saying he was known as the dancing mayor. A lot of times this happens. You'll see a lot of articles saying some person or some place was known as this or that, but you'll never find a contemporary reference to it. Like Beer Baron Row here in Chicago. Nobody called that stretch of road Beer Baron Row until like the 1990s. But we'll move on to a more traditional cemetery here. Of course, certainly a more famous one and an easier one to visit. So that alley into the New York Marble Cemetery is only open occasionally. And here we have Trinity Church, the spire of which was the highest point in New York for a long time. It was kind of a shock to people when the Brooklyn Bridge was made, and the Brooklyn Bridge towers were going to be higher than the spire at Trinity Church. Let's just take a look at a little bit of an overview here of the churchyard around the church. Always some tourists hanging around in their hoodies and shorts. This is the larger portion. On the other side of the church, there's a smaller portion. And people often wonder, how many people are buried here. And really, they don't know. There were some fires. The records aren't in very good shape. There's a lot of stuff they don't know about who all is buried here. But they know that it's quite a lot of people. Now, one estimate that gets tossed around a lot is that there are 200,000 people buried in this little churchyard. And I really doubt that that's exactly true. As near as I could trace it, there was something about the neighborhood around it had a population of that much in the 1850s. That somehow got transferred over into people saying that's how many people were buried here. But the 20,000 range, certainly I would not think would be out of the question. Now, just walking along here, you'd think that this was 6 feet of ground, like burials. It's not really the standard amount of burials. Plus, at a churchyard, they would have been stacking one on top of the other. But really, most of it was not just regular in-ground burials. Now here, on the back of it, you can see just how high above the sidewalk we are on the other side of the church. This is about how high up it goes. And this is all kind of lower, kind of full of different bodies. Most of these are also vaults. And down below the church, there are still a couple of vault entrances you can get to. If you open them up, they kind of look like this. This is the Bleecker family vault that was just reopened and fixed up just fairly recently. But when you get inside, they look like these old brick arches that are underneath that if you dig underground all over the place is just honeycombed with vaults like this. And they still tear them up and show them every now and then, just every now and then when something has to be interred there or something has to be fixed up. But things like this are common. You even see I happen to know that there's a row of unused brick vaults like this buried at Graceland Cemetery. And I know where it is. I've seen inside of a couple of them. I'm not really supposed to talk about that, though, so I will just shut on up. We'll go up here to the front. Yeah, that's those are generally what you'll see. You'll see these things like the Charles McEvers vault, and then should you dig down below there, it would be similar to what you would see back at the New York City Marble Cemetery. Inside, it looks about like this. Also, I'm going to allow us all a brief 7th grade moment here. There's a thing they talk about in cemeteries called the 7th grade effect. We're surrounded by all these monuments to mortality, and of course our inner 7th grader will kick in sooner or later. And we'll catch ourselves laughing at people with names like Abraham Cock. I always encourage people just to go with it. It's how your brain deals with death. We'll move over to one of my favorites. We've got this one with a very spooky death's head. Very spooky face. Then down below, the inscription is for a guy named Adam Allen, comedian. Now, Adam Allen, we don't know too much about. In 1758, he was in a place called a farce called the Stagecoach. Back in the 1770s, let me see how much bigger I can make this so we can just read it. Sacred to the memory of Adam Allen, comedian, who departed this life February 15th, 1768. This stone was erected by the American Company as a testimony of their unfeigned regard. He possessed many good qualities, but as he was a man, he had the frailties common to man's nature. What an epitaph. He had many good qualities, but as he was a man, he had the frailties common to man's nature. This could just mean that he was mortal. More likely, I'd say, it meant that he was always drinking and always in trouble. What we know about him is mostly just what we can find from looking up which parts he played. And they would often announce in the newspapers who was playing what part. We know that he played people like Friar Lawrence and Romeo and Juliet, but also did a whole lot of really broad characters, like the kind of people Jack Black might play nowadays, the people who just get redonkulous. We also know that he went bankrupt a couple of times. Now we can see here he's playing in a show called A Miss in Her Teens. Now, he played a character called Mr. Fribble. One person who saw this play said that nothing could be lower. There was a film of it made just back in 2014. I haven't been able to see it yet. He also is in such shows as The Stagecoach. which was a wild affair. He died in 1758, probably of something like consumption or possibly due to alcoholism or something else that would lead them to have an epitaph about like this. When he was in the Stagecoach, there was a thing in the paper that said it was a farce called The Stagecoach, which was described as the history of Mr. Allen and the Three Lawyers, which is a reference that is just kind of lost to history now. But apparently there was some kind of local scandal going on about Mr. Allen and a few different lawyers that everybody would have known about enough to catch that reference in the newspapers. We can only use our imagination these days. But we'll move on from him. I'd love to just talk about him the whole day, really. Walk a little bit past over here. James Sadler was a dry goods merchant, 1803. We'll just pause on James Sadler here because it's a neat old grave. Again, just about read the inscription here. Let's move it down a bit. This marble, designed with unambitious purpose and chiefly to preserve the remembrance of his friend, his excellent, dispassionate, and amiable qualities, sacred to the memory of James Sadler. We'll move over to from Sadler here to the one all the tourists want to see. And do I blame him? I do not. This is Alexander Hamilton, who nearly fought a duel, as I said, with James Monroe, who had tried to rat him out over uncovering the Reynolds affair. A few years later, he heard Monroe was in town and asked him to come for an interview and bring a second. So there was a flurry of near duels. It was actually Aaron Burr who talked them out of it. It was Hamilton, Monroe. Aaron Burr, the guy who would eventually kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel, talked him out of this particular duel. Maybe he just wanted him all to himself. But Lawrence Hamilton, Alexander's grandson, ended up dying while moving Monroe's remains to Virginia. He fell overboard and drowned, and he is over across the river at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn now. Upright in front of Alexander is Eliza, his wife, and they think, you can see the little marker right below me here, they think his son Philip, also killed in a duel, is probably buried here in this spot as well, but it's something they don't really know about. They don't really have all of the data again. But we know that Eliza is right in front of him. There's a marker. Xiao outlived him by 50 years. And then on the other side is Angelica, her sister. They've got Angelica and Eliza, but not Peggy. Angelica is right over here. We're also going to move over by, you see Hamilton there in the background, back on the other side. Another guy who made it into the musical. Just over here, I couldn't get too close to it, but this is the Mulligan family vault. This is Hercules Mulligan, who was married here at Trinity Church. This is the time he did not get back up again. He was a tailor who worked as a spy in the Revolution while working as a tailor for the Redcoats. He was a buddy of Hamilton. He's the guy who knocked down the statue of King George in New York and melted it down into bullets. May have saved Washington's life a couple of times. He also owned a human being. He enslaved a guy named Cato for a while, but then freed him in 1778 and became an abolitionist. So at least he got better. That's Hercules Mulligan. What a name. We'll move over from Hercules a bit. And over beside Hercules is this guy for a long time would have been more famous to your average person than Alexander Hamilton was. A guy by the name of Robert Fullerton. Robert Fullerton in 1807 invented the first successful steamboat. Earlier, he had made a submarine that supposedly was commissioned by Napoleon, but from the looks of it, he just invented it, tried to get Napoleon interested, and Napoleon kind of blew him off. Maybe it was a bad idea in the long run. But it worked. It was a very early example of a practical submarine before the Fool Killer here in Chicago. But he was much more famous in France. Yeah, they like Jerry Lewis, his genius was appreciated much more over there. But he switched sides, started working for the British in 1804, developed a bunch of torpedoes, married a woman by the name of Harriet Livingston, who was part of the Schuyler family. At the time, he was 42 and she was 19. The portrait here was painted by him. It's something we see a lot in these kind of stories, these kind of age gaps that just did not bother people at the time. We now understand that they should have, but the fact remains that back then they just didn't. We're also going to cover up by the front. Now, Marcia, who lives, who dies, who tells your story? Nobody lives, everyone dies. Tour guides tell your story, so be nice to your tour guides. Now, over here is a grave that appears to be to a fictional character. This is a grave marked Charlotte Temple. That was a reference to a popular novel that went around at the time, Charlotte Temple by Mrs. Rowson was the name. I can never quite remember it. We know who the actual author was now, but it was a hugely popular book about a girl who moves to the big city and falls to ruin. And sometime around the mid-1800s, after the book came out, there was a lot of debate about whether she was a real person or not. Evidence suggests not, but during some renovations at Trinity Church, the general sense is that some construction worker with a weird sense of humor decided it would be fun to mark up one of the slabs to say Charlotte Temple. They've actually gone so far as to probe underneath this slab fairly recently to see if there's actually a burial under there. Far as they can tell, there is not. But for a long time, it was popular when tourists came to New York, they'd show them the places where Charlotte Temple lived, and many people were probably under the impression that she really was an actual person. She was not, as far as anyone knows. Also, we'll check just briefly the oldest one here. Richard Churcher died in 1681, 16 years before the church was even incorporated, so he must have been moved here or something. Not too much is known about him. Take a look at the back of it here. The back of it's got these skull and crossbone symbols. They used to have these memento mori, these symbols that remind you that you too will one day die. Also, later, the Freemasons started using skull and crossbones. So when you see that symbol in Chicago, as you do on 2 or 3 different graves that I know of, it's usually just the Freemasons. Boy, did those guys have a lot of symbols. We'll cover one more just with the poem on here. And this is the thing in these older gravestones. You see so many more maudlin epitaphs that we see here in Chicago. These kind of things were out of fashion by the time people were really buried in Chicago in great numbers. This one is to a woman named Mary Dalzo. The inscription says, "Adieu, my dearest babes and tender husband dear, the time of my departure is now drawing near. And when I'm laid low in the silent grave, where the monarch is equal with the slave, weep not, my friends, I hope there be at rest. To be with Jesus Christ, it is the best." Now, this appears to be an original verse. This is something I've noticed that not a lot of these have really been transcribed. People haven't really studied these epitaphs very much. You can't really find a great database. There's some on their website, but nobody really looks into where these come from. As near as I can tell, this one was original. Nowadays, with so many old books digitized, I can usually find out where these things came from. We'll cover that a bit more up here at St. Paul's, down in the shadow of the World Trade Center and the Oculus. The weirdest looking shopping mall in the world. Man, I love that place. Also the most convenient bathroom stop in the city. But here's this churchyard that was miraculously unscathed by 9/11 debris. This was the church where George Washington went to church. And right up here at the front is the burial of George Eaker, a New York lawyer who made a 4th of July speech that some people said insulted Alexander Hamilton. Others say it was all just generic, patriotic, blah, blah, blah. But Philip Hamilton, Alexander's son, overheard him or read about it. Then it came up to him and harassed him while he was at the theater one night. Eaker called he and his friends damn rascals, and them's were fighting words. So they challenged him to a duel. It was a 2-day duel. On day 1, nobody was hit. So they decided to do a do-over, shot again on day 2, and at that time George Eaker shot Philip Hamilton. But he himself did not survive much longer. He got sick and died of what was probably consumption just a few months later. A few months before the Hamilton-Burr duel, anyway. Now, at the time of his death and the duel, as illustrated right here, here's a portrait of 2 guys really being mature and coming up with how they resolve their differences. You can see how well they dress up for it. Standing 10 feet away to shoot each other. Real mature. But he had previously been engaged to a woman by the name of Harriet, who later went on to be Mr. Robert Fulton. This was beforehand. Think how young she must have been when she was engaged to George Eaker. Ugh. Let's just move on. There are still a couple of like oaths of office that you can take where that you specify within your oath that you have that you have never participated in a duel. Like when Daniel Elston in Chicago became an alderman, he had to make a swear a thing like that. There's still a couple of states where they have that as a standard boilerplate oath. Though there's been a lot of talk about removing it now because, you should be taking these things seriously at the time. But this is Marin and Adam Bennett, who has... the epitaph says something like, "Consider this, ye mourning parents, and dry up your tears. Why should you lament that your littles are crowned with victory before the storm of adversity was begun? Oh, remember, they are not lost, but taken away from evil to come." Now, this is a paraphrase of a poem by James Hervey. Now, James Hervey wrote a book called Meditations Among the Tombs that was hugely popular in the 1700s. This is him at about the same age that I am right now, or possibly younger. He was only about a year older than I am now when he died. But let me see if I could match the face. Yeah, I can't quite do it. But he wrote a book called Meditations Among the Tombs that was hugely popular and is the source of a lot of the epitaphs of the era. He was a huge influence on William Blake, who, besides influencing some of his poems, he also did this painting called The Epitome of James Hervey's Meditations Among the Tombs. Cool. But some of the times the origins of the epitaphs is not really clear. And a lot of times that's weird because it's like the only thing we really know about these guys is what it says in the epitaph, even though it may just be generic pieties of the day. But also you see at the top here we got the face, which may or may not be supposed to be looking like them, probably not, and then the wings. We see this more in 3 dimensions in Chicago. That is the death's head, the soul flying away from the body. This one is Jon Jones, whose epitaph reads, "O most cruel sudden death, that did take this harmless breath, but the Lord hath thought it best to take his soul with him to rest." There's a book from the 1800s that says that was written by his wife. That's still 100 years after this thing was built, but about as close as we're going to get. Yeah, 1768. 100 years later, somebody said that his wife wrote that, but where they would have gotten that is anybody's guess. Move up here to another one. So James Wereland. Another James Hervey poem. "How loved, how valued, once avails thee not, to whom related or by whom begot. A heap of dust alone remains of thee. 'Tis all thou art, and all the proud shall be." That one is, I thought it was a Hervey, but it's from Alexander Pope. And one more of interest. And this one, John and Mary Cummings, who both have fairly generic ones. These variations on these come up quite a bit. And the one on Mary's is, "Afflictions for a long time I bore, physicians were in vain, till God was pleased to grant me ease and free me from my pain." This was a very common one at the time. It's even alluded to in David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. It's very an amusing way, too. He sees it on an inscription at the church, and I talked about another guy who died and said, "Afflictions long Mr. Bodgers bore, and physicians were in vain," and wondered if the physicians who were still going to the church liked to be reminded of that every week. Now and then you do see in the 1800s, you see these snarky replies to these things. Like one of the ones that you see quite a lot is, "My glasses run, my grave you see, prepare in time to follow me." One 1800s book of epitaphs notes that one on a grave in England, and it said that underneath somebody has scrawled, "To follow you I'll not content, until I know which way you went." And hey, while we're here, I was mostly covering just the epitaphs here. This is one I actually had in the second tech, but quick moved over because it's one of my favorite stories. One that comes up quite a bit on my tours. Is off in the distance here, the largest and most impressive monument usually turns out to be to a politician or some eminent person like that. This one is to an actor. A guy by the name of George Frederick Cook, shown here playing Richard III. He came to the United States in the early 1800s on tour, spent most of his time talking about how much he hated this place, but then drank himself to death while he was here. He was initially interred in something called the Stranger's Vault, but several years later some other actors thought, no, he was so influential, we've got to get him a proper monument. So he was removed and moved over here, supervised by a guy by the name of Dr. Francis, John W. Francis, who would later be Edgar Allan Poe's doctor, and somewhere in the course of all of this, helped himself to Cook's skull. Also one of his fingers. The skull is still extant. It's at Thomas Jefferson University today. But he kept it in his office for a while. This was still the age of phrenology. People like to say that they could read a skull the same way that others might read a novel. But according to Dr. Francis, not long after he took it and let it be known that he had it, somebody knocked on his door and said, hey, I'm from the theater. We just lost a bunch of our props, but we're doing Hamlet tonight. We hear you got a skull. So, according to a biography written right about this time, probably to cash in on the notoriety, on his deathbed, Cook says, I have played every part in Hamlet except for the skull. And then he got to play the skull. We'll just move on up from here. I can go on quite a bit about that story. There's other angles to it, but it's for another day. Let's go uptown. To Trinity Uptown, up on the northern end of Manhattan, is the much larger, going way up the hill, Trinity Cemetery. Not to be confused with Trinity Churchyard, they're controlled by the same corporation. So right here we've got the tomb of the Astors, one of a couple of Astor family plots. And this is usually said to be the place where the remains were eventually put of John J. Astor IV, a victim of the Titanic. His father, John of John Ford, was William. Trying to keep track of who's who in the Astor family is more than I'm really up to, honestly. But John IV had just married the 18-year-old Madeline. He was about 47. It was a big scandal in the Titanic. She was pregnant aboard the ship. May have given his spot on a lifeboat to Ida Hippock of Chicago, who is buried over at Rose Hill Cemetery now, but survived the trip. Buried about a mile from where I'm standing right now. There are quite a number of people here. There's John and Madeline. Move up and just look around over here. So John J. III was so successful as a dealer that Mrs. Astor was said to have been accused of witchcraft. Though it's hard to find a primary source on that. Jordana, I have had to take school groups on the subway occasionally before. I drill them so hard before we get on there. I've never lost a kid yet. Just a little bit more of the Astor plot. We'll move up along here. There's so many interesting people here, and I'm always finding more every time I walk around. Even though it's not the easiest place to walk around, you really had to have your climbing shoes on to get up this place. But around here, you'll find this nice marker to Mercedes de Acosta. Mercedes de Acosta was a writer and artist, one of the first real out and proud lesbians of her era, the late 19th, early 20th century. She wrote in her memoir that she grew up thinking that she was a boy named Raphael and was raised that way until she went to Catholic school, and the nuns told her she was not. And she told the nuns that she was either both genders or neither gender, which is a very modern way of looking at things, although of course they hadn't figured out how to think about things like that in those days. So by the 1910s, she was openly identifying as a lesbian, had affairs with Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, is said to have bragged that she could get any woman away from any man. Became more controversial after she wrote a tell-all book that just vaguely alluded to this kind of stuff. Just vaguely. That made her kind of controversial. So a lot of people thought that she should have kept her mouth shut, that it was naming names. Alice B. Toklas, Gertrude Stein's girlfriend, said, say what you will about Mercedes, she had some of the most important women of the century. She was widely derided for years. One person, they used to call her Countess Dracula, but now, of course, we're starting to reevaluate her. Not too much of her work survives, unfortunately. But here's what we got this graffiti nearby, Sex Work is Work, up here in Harlem, which is a very good graffiti to have right over here by the tomb of Eliza Jamel. Eliza Jamel, I first uncovered, I was going through the New York Telegraph. and found this advertisement, Madame Jamel's Memorial Balm and Patent Breast Elevator, to develop the form physiologically. That just got me curious. Who was Madame Jamel? Turns out Madame Jamel was Eliza Jamel, who had really a fascinating history. Now, theoretically, we all know in the United States that anybody can grow up to be anybody. You can grow up in a brothel and end up in the higher reaches of high society. But it's not clear that anybody else of her era actually did exactly that besides Eliza Jamel. Eliza was raised in a Rhode Island brothel where her mother most likely worked, but eventually her mother was arrested, and Eliza mostly just grew up in brothels. Moved to New York after both of her parents had died and started acting, got baptized down at Trinity Church, married a rich guy by the name of Stephen Jamel. They moved into a house that is still standing. It was formerly George Washington's headquarters, and the Jamel Mansion is still standing today. You can go on tours of it. They just recently had a big exhibition of Charles Addams, the Addams Family guy's artwork, but it was never open on a day when I was in town. I kept trying to go and never managed it. Eventually, Eliza and Stephen moved to Paris, where they claimed to be close friends of Napoleon. Probably were not really. Apparently, they just bought some of Napoleon's stuff at auction, and then so they could then come home and say, yeah, look who we were friends with. Well, later on, after Stephen died, he was kind of out of money. She was much better at investing the money than he was. And eventually, she went on to marry Aaron Burr. It was a very late-in-life marriage for him. He needed her money. She wanted his status. So she married the former vice president. Their divorce was finalized the day Aaron Burr died, and was represented by Alexander Hamilton Jr., who by then had met Abraham Lincoln himself. But let's do a little bit of tomb snooping here. You can see right into Eliza's tomb. And it's a pretty typical brick vault, only not buried. Like, even the coffin is made out of brick. I don't see that very often. All right, we're actually over time, but I want to go in just briefly to check out a little bit about Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. It's a little off topic. This is mostly a Manhattan Cemeteries tour. But I do feel like I should point out inside of here, first of all, there's parrots in the gates here. It's really cool. On the inside is a Hamilton family vault containing Lawrence Hamilton, who died while moving the remains of President Monroe. We'll just check out a couple of real highlights here. We have our pyramid here in Chicago. We checked out another pyramid at a grave in Toledo a while ago. I don't know what's going on here with my video. That's odd. It's just so bright. It was very bright the day I filmed here. I have bad luck with that sometimes. But here's a pyramid to a guy named Albert Parsons, who was an amateur Egyptologist, wrote a book called New Light from the Great Pyramid, which was completely unreadable. You can find it, it's completely unreadable. And I will move around. Most of the major Chicago gangsters are buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery out here in suburban Chicago. It's a great irony, they buried them all in the suburbs. Except for John Torrio, the guy who really built the Chicago outfit before turning everything over to Al Capone. John Torrio is up in here. After he was shot in the face, he had the sense to retire, though there's always been stories that he was doing a lot of the directing behind the scenes. And inside there's a stained glass pope looking over at a murderous gangster. Like you do. There's his slab, John Torrio. Let's move on up way up the hill. This is known as Battle Hill. People could watch the Battle of Brooklyn being fought from up this hill in the Revolutionary War. How long a video did I make of this? Okay, we're going to zip. But here's the statue of Minerva, the Roman goddess of battle, built for a guy named Charles Higgins, who was a manufacturer of India ink, who specifically wanted his monument to be a monument to the Battle of Brooklyn. Originally, the plan was for Minerva to face the Woolworth building in the lower Manhattan, the financial district. But somewhere along the line, they decided to tilt her a little bit so that she would be waving back at the Statue of Liberty. I always thought that was cool, that she's waving back like that. And there's one more quick one. Up on the same hill, just around the bend, is a guy who almost was like the epitome of New York in his era, the ultimate New Yorker, Leonard Bernstein, conductor of the New York Philharmonic. Something he first did when he was 25 years old. He was an assistant conductor. A guy got sick, so he was brought in at the last minute after being up pretty much all night to conduct a very difficult piece that he had no time to rehearse. Everybody in the orchestra thought, okay, we're just going to get through it. Hopefully the kid can keep time reasonably well. And he went into a drugstore first, and the guy told him, okay, I got just what you need. Here's a couple of pills. These will get you through it. But right before going on, Lenny decided, nope, I just want this to be me and God, and tossed the pills over his shoulder. He kept doing that, and went out and conducted so brilliantly live on the radio that he launched his entire career. There's a very famous Leonard Cohen quote that I just love. All that you really need for success is a plan and not quite enough time. Now he's got a delightful memorial bench here. You can go on YouTube, look up just like his young people's concerts, where he would play some orchestra music and then explain things like the modes and the key change and stuff that's even when he's explaining it to 8-year-olds, it's over my head. But it's fascinating to watch this guy talk. Especially fun to watch him talk about the Beatles. He loved the Beatles. He was actually a neighbor. He lived in the Dakota at the same time John and Yoko lived there. And here is his view from the bench. So, all right, everybody. Once again, I'm a little bit behind on coming up with upcoming tours, but we've kept up to our schedule so far. Tomorrow will be Mural Monday. Thursday night, I'll figure something out today. I've still got to do the Patreon stuff and all that for the week. But there's always stuff coming up. Thursday night's going to be Thanksgiving. I got a lot to compete with. So most likely I'll just do like a greatest hits or something and hang out. But now next week, we've got a whole other setup of, I've got enough stuff for a volume 2 of Manhattan Cemetery tours. So we'll probably do that for next week, and that keeps my mind off having to come up with what to do next. So always a lot of fun stuff coming up here at Mysterious Chicago. And with that, we will put the Benny Goodman back on and just hang out for a bit until lunchtime. So thanks for joining me, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. Thanks to everybody who has hit these various buttons to help keep the lights on here in the slow season when I'm not doing any ticketed events, really. So thanks a lot, and here's Benny again. Thanks, April. Thank you, Dina. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Larry. But where is lunch in NYC? Find yourself a Lenwich. You can't go wrong with a sandwich at Lenwich. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Darren. And Deborah. So that's just scratching the surface of just a couple of cemeteries there, really. And they stopped doing human burials in most of Manhattan fairly early on. They were really kind of stinking up the place and spreading cholera, so. Thanks, Carolina and Jean. Thanks, Diane. Enjoy the game, David. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, automats would still kind of be fun. No, they were probably awful. Let's be honest. Yeah, as long as I'm talking New York, Leonard Bernstein wrote the music for West Side Story, probably his most enduring piece. He also wrote symphonies like The Age of Anxiety. Lots of dead people like you, Sherry? Sherry, is there something we should know about you? Oh, the Hardenbergs of Hardenberg Automats? No, Hardenberg wasn't the right name. There was some name that starts with an HA. That was the name of a lot of the Automats. No, I don't think I've seen the documentary on Automats. That sounds fun. I know, I gotta get to Woodlawn. Maybe next trip. Virtual Washington, D.C. I don't know. I don't really go to D.C. too much. There's always work for a school tour guide there, but I don't like it. Too much opportunity for their small town parents to get political. I don't like it. Horn and Hard Art, yeah. But yeah, once again, I am in fact a licensed New York tour guide. Miles and Priya are around here someplace. I think one of them is in the window. Miles came by earlier when we got started. Hip-hop hot Gunness musical. Well, my name is Johan, and I'm here to say I'm the merriest guy in the USA. Miles is hanging out on the radiator back here. We'll go to him instead of the other way around. Yeah, we did about a year ago. We went to Arlington and did a couple of mini tours around D.C. While Mike and I were in town for the Bob Dylan concert. Here's Miles, lounging on the radiator. And the pitcher of water that I use, the standard issue water pitcher for 80s kids that I used to fill up the radiator pan. Yeah, he's right there. I don't know where Priya is at right now. Probably someplace warm too. Yeah, the radiator is nice and toasty. There we go, yeah. Yeah, radiator pan, well, I gotta go get some caulk, because there's, the sealant that I sprayed on it is still cracking. I'm still getting, like, rust in the water. Sealant's not too expensive. That should do it. I'm trying to get a new radiator pan, and you gotta, like, actually find a tinsmith. You know who was a tinsmith? Johann Hawk. You know who's a tinsmith now? We didn't have radiators when I was a kid. We had the big, like, central air units outside. I remember I loved to play on top of those, but Dad came out and very sternly told me that if I jumped on that, it would break, and we'd all get sick and die. That really freaked me out, too, Dad. Yeah, Flex Seal is probably what I'm going to have to get. So I've coated it with liquid rubber. But once the thing starts to warp, it cracks, you know. Yeah, the salvage place might be worth a check. But You kind of need specific dimensions for a radiator pan. Like everything like a kitchen pan or something is always a little too deep or a little too shallow. Dad, I don't suppose you do remember it. It was a one-time thing. But I know you didn't like me playing on top of the big AC units outside. And everywhere you go, any time of day. Valley sings it, wise men rings it. Even Mr. Crosby sings it. Let it go, let it fly away. I also need a couple of light bulbs. I've just kind of repurposed a bulb for this one right now. Well, the hue light that I had in there finally burned out after like 5 years. Well, that's pretty good for a light bulb that lasts like 5 years, plus a move.
Benny Goodman's Orchestra and the King Porter's Stomp.
Miles. It's a rubber band and not a cat toy. Yeah, Dad, that was on Parkview. That was probably like 6. Oh, the new lamp from about a year ago while I was looking up a Johann Hawk location and found that's still working well. Here, it's got... Looks different under different modes. This is my standard mode for it. This is the man cave look. This is what it's like when I'm broadcasting on Whiskey and a Cookie. Here's a dim light, I guess. And the blue room look. Alexa webcam. But this is the color. I gotta have a color that makes my skin look good when I'm broadcasting like this. I had to experiment a lot on that. Mysterian trip to New York City. I'd love to make that a possibility. I haven't figured out quite how yet. I don't really know how to do adult city tours. I've been keeping my December kind of open, just thinking there might be a suddenly announced run of Dylan shows at the Beacon, where he often does a small residency. But yeah, I don't know if I could chaperone this group. But I'm trying to take it a little bit easier this winter, other than working on a giant Johann Hawk book. So maybe I will in fact find time. Right now the house is clean. I don't feel like I have any chores to do other than fixing up the radiator pan and replacing a couple of light bulbs, which I could just do tomorrow. I should do it tomorrow. Home Depot will be crowded. Clark and Devon Hardware will be crowded. Probably have to get Aiden the chaperone. You guys want to see some of Aiden's art? Before I log off, I want to show you. Well, first of all, here's Miles on the desk. We just framed some of Aiden's art, his self-portrait. It's a very Gen Z kind of self-portrait he's put together here. Miles. Miles is running alongside me and flopping down. He wants all the pets.
Benny Goodman and his orchestra playing for you from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. This is the National Broadcasting Company. Rapidly taking its place among the first Big Ten of songdom, and which was first introduced by Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Let me just screenshot some of these comments for him. I think it's mostly charcoal. Miles. Miles has followed me up right onto here. Yeah. Carol, I don't know if I'll get an artist on Hawk, or if any publisher would let me pick who the artist was going to be. They don't usually. Miles. Miles doing his regular job to knock down the signed Bruce Springsteen album. Miles, get off of the laptop, please. Whoa. There's the guy. Purrin' and purrin'. I haven't heard about the HBO show. That sounds cool. The direction of the ceiling fans. I don't have ceiling fans. Miles, don't claw the sweater, please. There you go. You're really putting on a show today, Miles. Purring and purring. Yeah. Well, all right, everybody. So that was volume 1 of New York City Cemetery Stories. We will do next Sunday morning. We'll probably do volume 2. Thursday night, I'm brainstorming. I'll come up with something today. But thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, making sure everybody remembers that this week you got to stay warm, stay well fed. But of course, everybody, stay spooky, everybody. Have a great day.